Museum of Liverpool particularly focuses obviously on Liverpool's history and archaeology, and we have a team of 7 archaeologists at the moment who do both looking after a collection of around 100,000 items from Merseyside and the region, and also do a lot of community archaeology, so we do get out and we're allowed out to go digging once in a while as well. So I want to talk to you today about a project that, as you said, kind of looks at a particular site which is Victorian slum housing. But I was thinking about it in the context of kind of Victorians in museums more generally, because we see the Victorians everywhere, don't we? There's a lot of Victorian material culture in our museums, and in fact, pretty much all of our material culture, which was displayed before the 19th century, is done so through Victorian eyes to some extent or another. So it's not a topic that we're unfamiliar with. We have whole villages, buildings and museums that are reconstructed to be Victorian. And then we also have the Victorian cityscapes themselves, and we do a lot of interpretation in Liverpool, and as they do in a lot of other cities, using the actual cityscape to look at the Victorian period. So then, what can museum archaeology add to looking at that Victorian period? So the project that I'm talking about today is the Galkoff's and Secret Life of Pembroke Place project. This was a partnership that was run between 2016 and 2019 between the School of Tropical Medicine and the Museum of Liverpool. Now, that's a slightly unusual partnership. The only time we've done it before is when we were looking at snakes at World Museum. And it was really because the School of Tropical Medicine owned 2 really significant heritage assets, 2 significant buildings. And so the National Lottery Heritage Fund supported us to investigate those buildings and then the wider history of the street, Pembroke Place. So the 2 sites were Galkoff's kosher butcher shop. This was a building that was constructed in the 1830s and was initially a house and then went through various commercial uses before becoming a butcher shop around about 1907, and then had this amazing green tiled facade added around 1933. Unfortunately, the building is now in a very poor state of repair, so we've removed the tiles from that building, and they now reside in the Museum of Liverpool. And then just 3 doors down the street was the other heritage site, which is Watkinson's Terrace, which is the last surviving example of Liverpool courtyard housing. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how we discovered what there is in terms of the court. So like any good archaeologist, obviously we start with some maps, try and work out what's there. So do I have a pointer? I do. So this is Pembroke Place, here marked as Road to Wavertree, and here finally marked as Pembroke Place. It was Road to London, Road to Wavertree, Road to York. It went everywhere at various different stages of the maps, and then became Pembroke Place around 1800, we think probably associated with the Earl of Pembroke. And these 2 maps from 1765 and 1835 kind of show what happened in the area. Liverpool went through massive population growth in the late 18th and 19th century, booming as a port, and this whole area was developed initially as lovely housing for the merchants who were moving away from the small town. They were described as a row of goodly mansions on Pembroke Place in the early 19th century, and then gradually infilled with lower quality housing, including the courtyard housing. So by the first edition Ordnance Survey map, we can see this area very, very kind of crammed in. And then this is the court that we were specifically looking at because it's this section of it that survives. The 3 shops at the front and then 3 small houses behind. So it's a truncated remains of a courtyard which would have been surrounded by houses, and the rest was subsequently demolished. And these houses have only survived because they were reused as the back rooms of shops. So court housing is a form of high density, generally fairly low quality housing that grew up in Liverpool from the early 18th century, initially infilling spaces behind existing houses. And then by the 19th century was used as part of the formal planning and laying out of new streets to increase the population density, the number of houses that could be crammed in. So these houses were built back to back, and you would enter initially through an covered arched way into a courtyard with houses on either side, just 1 room deep, back to back, and then generally 3 stories tall, often with a basement. Some of the houses were fairly well constructed, a lot weren't, and almost all of them became very, very highly populated, very high density of population. So the quality of living conditions declined very quickly. And you can imagine with a lot of people living in these small spaces and outdoor toilets, very little sanitation, the quality of housing was very poor. So there was a lot of work done to record this housing in the 19th and early 20th century in order to improve conditions. So we've got a lot of historical sources about courtyard housing. So these photographs were taken in the early 20th century. There's some of the few interior shots of courts. There are lots of exterior photographs. Most courts were photographed, particularly immediately before demolition. But very few interior photographs that really show us kind of what life was like there. And in the 19th and early 20th century, there were also a lot of descriptions of the courts. There are public health officers. Liverpool had the world's first medical officer of health, a public health officer, and he actively campaigned against court housing as early as the 1840s. There are doctors who are visiting and describing particular individuals and living in courts and the conditions that they were living in. And then there are also journalists who are visiting courts, sometimes quite voyeuristically, but describing what life is like in the courts. There was this literary movement of slumming, where people would visit slums and describe what it was like, and we certainly have that in Liverpool. So if we're looking at a particular court, there's a good chance that we have some very good evidence of it. So this is the court that we actually excavated. I think this is probably the only time I've ever excavated something where I can literally see in a photograph exactly what we've dug up, which is very exciting. And what we really wanted to do is kind of to pull together the evidence that we have of the court from both the material remains and the historical sources. But what we did was we worked with a lot of volunteers. We had, throughout the project, we had nearly 70 volunteers working with us, which meant that they could really, really go into the depth of the documentary evidence about this one Liverpool street. And it was quite a street. There was a zoo in the 1830s. There was a magician lived there in the 1850s. There was even a roller skating rink in the 1870s. It was quite a place. But by no means were all the stories that we found good. In fact, court housing, and particularly this area of Liverpool, was quite a difficult place to live. It was known by the 1880s as Little Hell because it was the area of poorest living conditions. It was the area where there were most brothels, and we found newspaper reports recording 6 violent deaths there in the 19th century. So there are a lot of things that we needed to kind of consider when we were looking at the stories and how we would investigate it and how we'd interpret it. So we did a lot of research. We tried to find out as much as we could. We tried to pull together all of this evidence, and we tried to find out what people really thought about this place. And so we kind of went into the detail of some of these stories. So these are a couple of the murders. So one of these is actually my favourite murder, which is the man who was murdered by his wife. He was found to be frequenting some of the local brothels, and she wasn't very pleased about that, as you might imagine, and so she took to chaining him to his bed. And one day he escaped, and she put his trousers in the basement, so if he did get out of the chains, he still couldn't go out. And he managed to get his trousers on, and she found him, and she beat him to death. So there's some really gruesome stuff in here. And so we did a lot of work where we did some consultation. We tried to look at how to interpret some of these stories with visitors and what we could do with that. But the really special thing that we're able to do through this project was to do the very first excavation of courtyard housing in Liverpool. So as I said, there's been a lot of work done using the historical sources, but no courts had ever been excavated archaeologically previously. So this was what we could really add to that picture. So we started off looking at the standing remains, which is what first attracted us to look at this particular part of Liverpool. So this is a photograph of Watkinson's Terrace, which is that truncated court. And we did a lot of work to investigate that. We looked at the census and we tried to find out about the people who were living in that area and looked at that in the context of of court housing across the city of Liverpool. By the mid-19th century, approaching half of Liverpool's working class population were living in courts. And so to look in detail at the kind of population in one particular court or one particular area was really important to be able to understand, the social conditions of different areas of the city. We also looked archaeologically at the building, so working with some of our volunteers, we've done some building recording, looking at some really weird and wonderful bits of the building where we've got, this is the courthouse, so just one room wide and one room deep with a doorway which would have had steps up to it and blocked in windows, but then a back door to the shop front with a weird kind of archway above it. If anybody's got any ideas about that, I'd be really glad to hear your interpretation. And then we wanted to look in more detail. It wasn't practical to be able to excavate the rest of that truncated court, but what we did was we investigated the area just behind. So this is the court that this is the court that we were just in the previous photograph, and then this is where we excavated. So because this area was so densely packed with courtyard housing, there were courts on every street backing onto one another. So we looked at Missionary Buildings, which is a court off Oak Street, which backed onto Watkinson's Terrace, and we started to dig and see what we could find. Now this site had been reused. These were courts that were built in the 1830s and demolished in the 1930s, and this area had been reused in light industry kind of subsequently, and as you can see was a car park until we dug it up. So we didn't know kind of what level of archaeological remains that we would find and how much that had been truncated. It doesn't want to move forward. There we go. And this is what we revealed. So we were really pleased with the level of preservation of the cellars of this court. Of course, if you're excavating sites with cellars, that's you're onto a winner, aren't you? Because we're likely to get remains. So we found the front wall of one house, and then we just found the edge of the trench, the front wall of the other house. So we have the full width of the courtyard here. The actual stone flagging had obviously been robbed away, and we're looking at the cellars here. And then we've got windows which have been blocked in, and we've also over here got some of the guttering drainage system as well. At this end we've got a coal hole, so we've got all of the features that are seen in photographs and described historically of the court actually recorded in the archaeology. So this is one of the windows in detail. So you've got a light well here, down to the window. So this is the actual windowsill from the window, and then the window's been blocked in. There was a documentary sources tell us about windows being blocked in courts quite forcibly to stop people from using the cellar spaces as domestic spaces. So that was probably part of that process around about 1900. And then, of course, being archaeology, we've got lots of interesting material remains. And this is really where it does get interesting, because the material remains of objects particularly start to tell us a slightly different story from what you see in the material remains of in the literary descriptions and the historical descriptions. So we get things like a nice bone domino, which is a nicely made little object. We've got this egg, which is, we think, used in keeping chickens. It was, these were warmed up and put in with chickens to encourage them to lay. I'm getting nods, that's good. That's not a story I knew about before we did this excavation. That tells us a little bit about the presence of animals in these courts, which isn't something you see in the photographs. Although we know about urban dairies and things like that, we don't see chicken coops and things in the photographs, so it's a slightly different story. We've got some ceramics which are perhaps slightly better quality than you might expect from houses that were described by medical health officers as being full of oozing filth, for example. So, it does sort of jar a little bit. And then we've got a number of bottles. So as we were digging these, we recovered a number of complete or near complete glass bottles. And as you can see there, they're embossed, so there's a lot we can find out about them. Now, as we were digging them, we I think jumped to the conclusion they were perhaps beer bottles, but actually investigating all of the marks on them has revealed that they're all from minerals and mineral waters. There isn't a single bottle that would have contained alcohol represented in the assemblage. We got one bottle stopper that said Cops Ales on it, and we said, right, we've found them, they are drinking alcohol. But actually, Cops Ales was a non-alcoholic ale. So there's an old bit of a story going on there, and we don't know whether there's something to do with differential systems for return of glass bottles. We don't know if the name Missionary Buildings might have something to do with it, whether it's perhaps the Liverpool City Mission who may have built this court and maybe perhaps forcing temperance on the occupants, or it may be just the sheer chance that these people were not drinkers, so we don't know. But it is bringing up different questions than anybody's ever really asked about courtyard housing in Liverpool before, because we've got this new evidence. I just wanted to throw this in. This is the one corner of the trench where we've got a little bit of the stone flagged surface of the court. It's one of the few pieces that did survive. And then this is a little entryway between two houses. So this is one front wall, and then we've got a little entryway. And this actually is just here, where we've got this little entryway through from our court that we excavated through to the next bit of courtyard housing. You often get these links through. They were called the courts and alleys in the 19th century because you get these links through. But it's Anson Terrace specifically that was named as Little Hell. So as we excavated, we found the entranceway through to Little Hell. So as an archaeologist, we dug the entrance to hell. I'm quite proud of that. So the archaeology and the historical sources, as we add them together, are starting to build up a bigger and different picture from what we previously knew about courtyard housing. So we wanted to do more to interpret that in a museum context. So bear in mind, we only did this excavation last year. We've not done a lot yet, but we had already had a certain amount of interpretation about courtyard housing. The Museum of Liverpool opened in 2011 and replaced a predecessor museum, the Museum of Liverpool Life. And in the old Museum of Liverpool Life, we had a reconstruction of a court. And when we did a lot of consultation for the new Museum of Liverpool, that was one of the things that people said they really wanted to see. A lot of people in Liverpool do family history research, find that their ancestors live in courts and want to know about it. It is a sort of a topic people are interested in. So when we developed the new Museum of Liverpool, one of the things that we featured was a reconstruction of a court. So this is probably where I first got interested in court housing, was doing the research for this reconstruction. So this is based on census research for a court in North Liverpool, and the interpretation sort of embedded around the courtyard is all based on one particular court in 1871 census. So there's already some existing interpretation about court housing, drawing on those historical sources. And then to look at kind of how we could build on that, we did a little bit of visitor research. We had a student worked with us from the University of Liverpool who did some visitor surveys to try and work out what elements of the dark heritage we might be able to interpret. And she really asked, she showed people some of those stories that I just shared with you, and she really asked about what was and wasn't acceptable for people to explore. So we then, based on that, did an exhibition. This was something that our volunteers curated as part of the project at the Liverpool Record Office at Liverpool Central Library, a temporary exhibition for a couple of months. This was the interpretation they wanted to do. They wanted a murder map with pins and red string. That was their way of doing it. So we've largely recreated this in an exhibition now in the Museum of Liverpool based on what they wanted out of it. And then we wanted to add more information based on the latest research, the excavation that we've just done. So working with another student, Lee here, we have done a display of some of the finds from the excavation. Now Lee is blind, and so she did a lot of work with us where she listened to oral histories that we'd recorded between 2011 and 2015 with people who remembered living in courts between the 1930s and 1960s. And so she's picked out quotations from those oral histories which actually describe the exact objects or stories associated with the exact objects that we located. So she explored the collection with us and then listened to all the oral histories, many hours of it, and picked out the relevant stories. So we've been able to add new layers of interpretation about Victorian material culture using the evidence from this excavation. It's something that we want to build on more. It's something that we want to enhance, particularly in the more permanent exhibition of the court. And having the evidence of the excavation is really, really helping us to be able to build that up. So more to come.